Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Open University.
Namaste friends, I welcome you to Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University Ahmedabad. At Chaitanya Studio, we are recording lectures for your MA English online lectures, and within that we begin our dialogue on paper 3, that is Western Literary Criticism. The topic is Plato, his attack on poetry. I am Dr. Deep Trivedi and I am Associate Professor of English at Indian Institute of Teacher Education. And together we will try to understand Plato's views on poetry. Friends, when we talk about Plato, who is regarded as the most celebrated disciple of Socrates, he was a renowned Greek philosopher. In his most important and most voluminous creation, that is the state, rather known as the Republic, Plato included some of the most characteristically philosophical concepts, which were an expression of his interests also. Apart from the various fields like teaching, such as metaphysics, theology, ethics, psychology, pedagogy, state system, which results from this creation, art and poetry could not go without being included as well. He also included even music into that. Otherwise, Plato himself in the very young age, except with mathematics, he also dealt with poetry by believing that he is going to be more dedicated to it. That was his early days, but then that was during the old days. But it seems that acquaintances with his teachers, exclusively Socrates, since he was 20 years old, changed his mind, and he was fully committed to the philosophy as subject. His general philosophical reviews, sublimating his philosophical ideas, which arise on the basis of the idea as an alpha and omega of every human being in the world, took Plato away from poetry by making him more and more torrential in philosophy, and also more and more critical, at points more cynical towards poetry. The age of Plato was concerned with the upliftment of national characters, the standard of social and public life. During the time of Plato, gods and heroes were represented in an unfavorable light. Hence, they were subjected to severe criticism by the philosophers and educationists. Thus, poets were considered to be inferior to the philosophers and also orators. The philosophers endeavored to reform the contemporary state, society, and citizens in order to have a better living. So Plato's views on poetry stood as an outcome of the prevailing social factors. Athens in the time reflected a period of political decline and dissolution. Education faced severe challenges. The epics represented gods and heroes in an unfavorable light, which, if we refer to the moral grounds, were further criticized by philosophers and also educationists. However, Plato is the first philosopher which raised the issues of poetry in his writings. Now, that is significant about Plato, that he could relate it with his writings, and that got compiled. Relation between the poets, poetry, and the state and society, they were the major subjects. But he is also first Greek philosopher which emphasized divisive elements between philosophy and poetry. We should try to understand that major arguments that come through Plato, particularly in the form of criticism, they are more or less surrounded by three major grounds. I mean, they are based on three major grounds of his argument. They include moral grounds, they include even emotional grounds, and also intellectual grounds. And around that particular reference only his major potential dialogue arises. Plato, being much aware of these things and being profoundly influenced, was not in favor of poetry as a teacher, rather I should say, because being a student he was a great admirer of poetry. His attack on poetry can be explained by dividing it into three categories which we just enlisted: moral grounds, emotional grounds, and, as I said earlier, intellectual grounds. The literature of the age resonated similar deterioration, and the Greek golden age of Greek literature was a period of the past. Later, literature had become corrupt, immoral, and of low standard. And that is where perhaps the argument arises. If to comment upon poetry with potential argument through a teacher sounding mind, and if yes, then what should be the major grounds of assessment and what should be the parameters of dialogue. So Plato's Republic on number of basis happens to put forward the arguments which were later on treated as attacks on poetry and also poets. Plato's statement that poets deserve to be banished is of course little harsh, but then that was his argument, and that is one of the most famous views of great thinkers in relation to poetry, because from there only the arguments arise. From there onwards the actual discussion begins, particularly in Western criticism. So that laid the foundation of the argument exchange, the opening of formal talk on the nature of literature, the nature of poetry in reference to the fact that poetry was treated as a common noun to all the genres of literature then. So when Plato talked about the ideal in Republic, he gave no place to poets there. He believed that the poets, they appeal to altogether different sides which are not exactly wanted to establish an ideal republic. So Plato, like many other philosophers, he desired to advocate the superiority of philosophy over poetry, that is, in a way, superiority of philosophers over poets. So Plato's literary criticism was aimed at motivating the young people in the society to become capable enough to be the ideal citizens, or rather citizens of the ideal state. He believed that poets' influence on youth was not appropriate. Now this takes us to the further details that why a philosopher like Plato is is not acknowledging to the very nature of poetry, or rather I should say literature in general, and why is he coming so harsh towards literature. So there are few grounds of assessment that we now try to understand, uh, realizing the fact that basically Plato attacks all the arts, not just literature, including poetry, on the twin standards, namely their inability to mold individual character. So his focus, or his major part of concentration was towards building up individuals' character in strength, so that they produce better citizens for the nation. They needed strong characters, or to promote the well-being of the state. So the concern was the state and not the individual. In addition, he has three major grounds that we talked about, and we may go into details now further. So we begin our discussion with poetic inspiration, or rather I should say the intellectual ground, on the basis of which he happens to bring about his accusations, or rather attacks on poetry. So which are the intellectual ground related attacks that we see? The first, he believed and he commented that way, that poets write by inspiration and not by a prolonged thought over the work. The muse suddenly fills him and makes him sing the poem. So he questions, the very authenticity of the poet's mind. He questions the originality of the content and says that the poet is inspired by the muse. He needs the muse to inspire him, and only then after he is able to produce something. So he questions, can such an idea have any reliability? So that potential question is there, and he says that this cannot be, treated as something measurable. That something which is inspired, something which is not original, how can it be treated as a reliable consideration when it comes to forming into an idea through literature? So poetry says profound truth with no reason. That is what the basic observation is withdrawn through that. Therefore, it cannot take the place of philosophy. So he puts reason over poetic wisdom, and he says that poetry is something that is not superior to philosophy. Plato, for this reason, removes poets from his ideal commonwealth, we can call it, which he imagined in his work, that is the Republic, and that was his idea of an ideal state. We call it utopia these days. And Plato has criticized poetry on intellectual grounds, referring to the ignorance of the poets, that is, their being ignorant of cognition of truth, as they imitate the appearance and not the reality. So more or less he believes that the poets, they are inspired, and they are inspired by the appearance and not the reality. That is the original idea is in the mind of the god. The god inspires a carpenter to prepare a chair, to furnish a chair, and by looking at a chair the poet writes a poem. So it's almost twice, thrice removed from the reality. So his emphasis is that poets are not exactly close to reality, and they imitate appearance and not the soul and not the reality. Thus, poetry cannot be considered to be the valid source of knowledge, and that was his first attack, that it cannot be treated as a valid source or authentic source of knowledge. Now, knowledge is a comprehensive term within which even literature falls as one of the potential source. He did try to remove that very practice, and he was of the opinion that we must validate the source first, and it should be realistic and not twice or thrice removed from the reality. Wordsworth once happened to say that turning loose of emotions in the state of tranquility uh, is the view that comes through a renowned poet Wordsworth, and that is point number two. That is his second argument, wherein Plato calls poetry something which appeals to lower base emotions. You see, tragedy makes men weep, and weeping is weak. He believed that uh, he needs strong men and women to come out and live with the society in you can say rather a compatible sense than being weak by weeping. So he never welcomed the idea of tragedy in that sense. He also denied accepting comedy being treated as one of the sources of entertainment, because that also leads to unnecessary laughter, again appealing to lower base emotions. He never wanted even that category of people who keep laughing unnecessarily. So that objection is referring to even emotions, the lower base emotions. The poet composes. That is what he says, that the poet composes in a fit of inspiration, which may fail the taste of cool reasoning. A sudden outpouring of the soul cannot be, dependable substitute for the truths which are based on the reason. So poetry cannot take the place of philosophy. He re-emphasizes it again and again, and that keeps on happening within the part of discussion further. So nor can it serve the individual or the state in any favorable manner. So he advocated the very idea, he promoted the idea that uh, the poets shall be banished from his ideal state. That was his general view that initiated the conversation, and from the ideal commonwealth, he believed that unless they composed devotional song or songs of praise of famous men, uh, they cannot be included. So that was the first objection. Then you have the emotional appeal of poetry. Now, on these grounds, when he begins his argument, this is his second ground of argument, wherein he says that the emotional appeal of poetry, it kindles the emotional part of human being. And Plato, considering his age, tragedies, complains that the constant intake of others' grief makes people weak to carry out their own sufferings. Like what I said earlier, in order to maintain the happiness and virtue of humankind, poetry should be taken away. So he's again and again emphasizing on the fact that the poetry in general sense, it should not appeal to weaker emotions, or it should not weaken the citizens of his ideal state. And Plato also divides the human soul into three parts, and that is where he lies another he tries to put the foundation to his thought by referring to three different types of emotions: parts, rational, spirited, and appetitive. And the poetry, he believes, that always focuses on the third part of the soul, that is the appetitive part, or the desire. In general sense, we adapt it that way, as it gives great pleasure at the moment. When you are through some part of literature, it gives you pleasure, fine. But then according to Plato, that is not always something that appeals to the right amount of emotions and right aspects of emotions, and thus it often ignores reason, which henceforth becomes full of vices. So it leads to that weakness, leads to development of vices within the society or the ideal republic that he imagined of. And Plato objects that being productive of inspiration, poetry affects emotions rather than the reason. He was highly distrustful of the emotions, which, according to him, created a sort of illusion. He re-emphasized the idea that the emotional parts, when they appeal to human beings, they are often they create illusions and don't allow people to reach close to reality, or the idea of reason, or philosophy has its foundation on reason. So he he somehow has a different context to relate to, and he believed that emotions weaken man and are contradictory also to the views of philosophy. So this was something which bothered him, and such emotional outburst with the beauty of form, added to the original inspiration, cannot act as safe guides to reason. So he believed that his countrymen, or the citizens of his ideal state, should be in the company of reason, should be in the company of philosophers who are close to reality, and not something that is emotionally guided, particularly the lower base emotions, which have the capacity to even misguide the general conduct. The third aspect is the non-moral character of poetry that Plato accuses. He indicts poetry for its lack of concern for morality. In its treatment of life, poetry treats both virtue and vice alike, and it pained, Plato to observe that there was no poetic justice in literature, esteemed particularly in his days. Uh, Homer's epics, say for example, even Pindar's odes, and even the tragedies of Aeschylus or Sophocles and Euripides. He believed that the ideals that the society look forward to, they are usually found in the subjects, uh, or the characters like gods, goddesses, kings and queens. But then they were treated, or rather they were presented as full of vices in the moral sense. You can say that was something wrong, and he believed that poetry should have the element of natural justice, or rather poetic justice, in the appropriate manner, because painting the gods and goddesses as full of vices leads the countryman into wrong direction. So he further objected to the representation of gods and heroes in unfavorable light. Presentation of gods and goddesses as full of envy, anger, or maybe when they are presented as people with strong emotions, or carrying altogether uh, wrong emotions, rather in the form of, you can say, practices like they were presented as drunkards even. So they cannot be presented into unfavorable light, because that would mislead the citizens altogether in a wrong direction, and that is not good for the state. So such literature, he believed, had the capacity to corrupt both the citizens and the state. So in assessing Plato's condemnation of poetry, we also need to remember that he adopted a kind of utilitarian or pragmatic view of art, and Plato's stand was that of a moralist here. His attack was there, but then his more or less, his participation, the way it comes through his attack on poetry, is more or less through the moral correction. He somehow wanted to act as a moralist and not so much as an artist. So his leaning was more towards the moral sense and not towards the artistic sense. And this is an accusation of the lack of character in poetry. through an analysis of his age, literature such as the epics of Homer, the odes of Pindar, and tragedies of Aeschylus or even Sophocles and Euripides, he comes to a conclusion that art basically transmits a wrong message to people. Now, this was little harsh, and of course, later what we get to know about is Aristotle defended literature in probably the most enthusiastic zeal. So that we will try to study in the course of time. But here he believed, I mean, Plato believed that he was of the conclusion that art transmits a wrong message to people. Now that is little harsh. In the words of Plato from his work Republic, he happens to state that they give us to understand that many evil livers are happy and many righteous men are unhappy, and that wrongdoing therefore here is justified. Now, when you use the word they, the meaning refers to, or the philosopher is addressing to uh, the art in general sense, or rather artists are blamed here. The portraits of gods and heroes are equally objectionable because gods are often unjust. That is what he is objecting against. That how can you present gods and goddesses as unjust and not following the natural justice or poetic justice, being the fact that that is going to give wrong impression to the countryman and the citizens of his ideal state that he has imagined for the betterment of his own state, or the idea of republic, the way he is trying to put here. So, how could you present gods as unjust or even revengeful, envyful, guilty of other vices, and why the heroes are always, they are there with the uncontrollable passions like anger, pride, grief, and so on. I mean, there are a number of limitations to human character, but how could you present, that was his objection, that how could you present the ideals of the society into wrong shape? So, Plato strongly condemns that such literature is corrupted by both the citizens and the state. He also happens to state the function of poetry, and he suggests that truth as the test of poetry, which is what contribution it makes to the knowledge of virtue. That is what he says. That is his question, that what contribution, that is poetry when I say it, what contribution it makes to the knowledge of virtue. Poetry is a pleasure to read or to hear, but according to his pleasure, at the highest kind is also at low ranks. So, in a famous passage in the Republic, he says that we must look for artists who are able, out of the goodness of their own natures, to trace the nature of beauty and perfection, that so our young men, like persons who live in a healthy place, may be perpetually influenced for the good. Plato wants poetic truth to be the highest truth, or we can say ideal form of justice, goodness, beauty, and the like. So, friends, this is where we conclude the three major charges that he happens to put while condemning poetry, or while alleging poetry and poets in general within the given context as Plato's attacks on poetry. At this particular moment, we should be able to we should be wise enough to understand that Plato's remarks, they came through his stand as a critic As a student, he too admired the poetry that came through Horace and many other, potent writers of that age. But here you get to know about his views rather from the assessment that come through a philosopher, a teacher uh, who is little strict in the conduct, and he ranks poetry lower to philosophy. So I think you people will be able to figure out the basics within the discussion proposed here with. Please go through number of other references also in terms of reading, and sure, we will avail even some part in the form of reading. Thank you so much. uh, I wish you the best. Thank you.
स्वाध्यायः